A fundamental challenge to the city's goals of equity and inclusivity for the UHC development is its grounding in a market-based real estate development process. Real estate development is an extractive wealth-building process. It must engage a capitalist system that is not now nor has ever been equitable. The 48 acres of land that constitute the UHT development is currently owned by the city of Minneapolis. The decision to sell the land to a private developer perpetuates the existing historic wealth disparities in the city and the state. Land ownership in the United States has always been a generator of wealth. The transfer of this asset from public to private hands is a long-term economic benefit for largely the white companies and individuals outside of North Minneapolis. The CPC has become much more of an advisory committee with members reacting to the city's direction, not helping to shape that direction. In our view, this project cannot achieve its lofty goals of equity and inclusivity with a mostly top-down structure that does not share power and is unwilling to consider alternative strategies or timelines to get the work done.
Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
All right, hello, welcome to the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. We got a breaking news story, a really important real-time update in the Upper Harbor Terminal development. I'm pleased and honored to sit with Paul Bauknight, Northside developer, architect, and former member of the Upper Harbor Terminal Collaborative Planning Committee. Paul has recently issued a powerful resignation letter and stepped off of the committee, and I think it's important to hear why and how, and excited to have Paul here to reflect with us. So thanks for being with us, Paul.
Thank you, Jake, for having me on.
Can you just say a little bit about yourself? Who are you, and how did you come into this world of community and economic development?
Transplant from New Jersey, born and raised, been in Minneapolis since 1989. Went to school to be an architect, decided to be an architect when I was in the 6th grade. My passion in this profession has always been around the connection between the built environment and economics, culture, and the physical world. So I've always worked on the community side, whether it's affordable housing, schools. That's always been my work in what I do. And I've lived on the north side for now probably 20 years.
Awesome. And why did you apply to be a part of the Upper Harbor Terminal Collaborative Planning Committee?
So I applied to be on the committee because I want to be part of making a difference in my community. That's distinct from not wanting to make a project.
So you started to talk about it when you talked about your passion for architecture. Could you say more about the values that drive you in this work when you're doing community development? Say more about that. What are your values? What do you hope to bring for community?
So first of all, it's always about community, and it's always about the people who live here and how, in the work we're doing, how does it impact their lives and make it better? And how are they part, though, of the whole process of getting to those solutions? Because community knows really best what's going on and how to get there, and we should just be the vehicle from more of the professional expertise of how do I translate that into something. But at the end of the day, it's all about how community does that, and really how do we make sure that that power paradigm shifts. So how are we really sharing power in this process of getting something done and not really being part of a process that's controlled by other people?
So let's get right into that. You know, this collaborative planning committee was appointed in the late spring and has been meeting now for 3 or 4 months, correct? Mm-hmm. What's your experience been like on the collaborative planning committee thus far, and why did you choose to resign from the committee?
Well, I think that the idea of having the collaborative planning committee was correct. I think that with all respect to Councilmember Cunningham, he was looking for a way to involve community at a higher level to help make decisions around what was going to happen. I've talked with him many times, and I think he really believes that community should be deeply involved in the process.
Yeah.
So the committee was an outgrowth of unrest around the concept plan development, and this was a way, I think, to say as we move forward to coordinated plan, we're going to have a committee. So I think that was genuine and real. I think, like in anything, though, the work to really think through how would this work, how would the committee mesh with all of the other processes going on, and how this project was moving forward needed to be thought through a little bit better before we started. I think, the timeline has never shifted, and that's always been a concern of mine, how quickly the project was moving. So
you're saying that the initial timeline that was established between the developer and the city has
Yes.
never shifted
Right.
in response to this
Right.
effort to try to get more
Right.
people involved.
Right. So inserting a collaborative planning process, which is saying we're going to work together to do this, really means that you need more time to get there. So that was a challenge from the beginning. For me, I thought that my experience working in community, my cross-sector experience of not only as an architect, but also having led the African American Men Project, having been on, in lots of other nonprofits and done lots of cross-sector work, and really looking at this from how do we really build opportunities for people on the North Side, how do we build wealth, how do we build power, how do we do that, and how is this project more of a catalyst for that kind of thing, was why I wanted to be part of the committee. And so as the committee got going, like in any startup, there are bumps along the way. That's to be expected. I do not think the committee ever got in a rhythm, and we really never coalesced as a committee. And to do this kind of work, that you have to coalesce. And I don't think the committee had time to kind of do that kind of work, to come together, and we are thrust right into, we have to make these decisions.
Yeah, from my perspective, I've been coming to these committee meetings not as a member, so as a community member. I didn't apply to be on the committee, but I'm very interested and passionate about the project, and it's been frustrating to watch because I see that honest desire that you're expressing, and a lot of people, I think, in good faith, want what's best for the North Side. But to think about the reality of doing deep democracy in this way, or really engaging community, that's a deep process. You can't half step, and I think that's the fundamental flaw, has been a good idea, but then not the container and the space created to actually engage. You're talking about working class people who have been barred from these processes for generations. It takes more than a few meetings to get to the point where you're really talking about sharing power. So could you talk a little bit more about, as the summer developed and the fall developed and we got to where we are now, say more about what it's been like in the committee. When did you start to really fundamentally question what was happening, and what finally prompted you to make the decision to step away from the committee?
Well, I've worked in community for a long time, so I'm used to messy, difficult processes, and so that's nothing new. And for unrest and all of those things, as you know, Jake, when you work in community, that this is just part of the what happens, and it happens everywhere, not just on the North Side.
And it's positive. Conflict is positive.
Yes, exactly. So as we continue, first, I think the organization of how we were going to do and what we were going to do was not very clear. And we were, kind of moving around from subject to subject, but it wasn't within context and within where are we trying to go and how do these things mesh. And how do they interact? You can't talk about housing without talking about jobs. And you can't talk about jobs without talking about education. All of that goes together. Clearly, We had some struggles with facilitation, and it became clear that the committee was just having a hard time doing its work, where at the same time, though, the pressure continued on, we have to hit these milestones and we have to get to this schedule because that's where the driver is. So as I continue to be part of the committee and wanting to continue to try to make a difference, I began to see, though, that, well, there's not room to do that, and the pressure to hit the deadline that's been set is going to continue, and the inability to really have deep and fundamental discussions about what should we do and why, and is this really an option or not, and are these things on the table, and really not there being clarity about, well, what's untouchable and what isn't.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to do your work, there are some things that are like, okay, that just is not, we can't touch that. But all of that together also, though, with for me, a continued, really, I can't do the kind of work and make the kind of difference that I want to, that I believe in, that I think is necessary based on not only my experience, but truthfully, I'm really a geek about all this policy stuff, and I read all this stuff, and I look at this stuff, and all the people doing this kind of work are taking this deep time. If you go to the 11th Street Bridge project, it's years of work. So it was becoming clear that, okay, I'm really struggling here, and I don't know if I can continue.
So I imagine that was a tough choice. What I know about you, why I felt good about having you on the committee, is I feel like it's obvious that you have Northsiders in your heart and in your mind when you're doing that work. So you have both the language of the development world and architecture, but also are grounded in community. What were you feeling around making that decision, and why does it felt like, since that's a big decision to make,
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about what's that been like for your spirit and for your heart?
So, I was really troubled. I'm a Northsider, and this is a generational decision, and this is something that's going to affect my children and my children's children if we think about what's going on. And I always want to be working in the best way to make a difference for Northsiders, and I just was in conflict. Like, I can't do that in this space, in this system. And I can either stay in this system and be frustrated all the time and be continually at odds with where this is going, or I can step out of this system, but continue then to advocate and work to make things better.
Honestly, I've really had to wrestle this summer, because I chose not to be a part of the committee, because my analysis was this, is that when the unrest and the pressure that led to the creation of the committee was asking fundamental questions about the development. It was saying we shouldn't be moving forward with a private real estate project with the wealthiest people in Minnesota. We should come back to co-create. So when the committee, the parameters around the committee were established to say you don't get to question who is the developer, you don't get to question if there is going to be a music venue, only the size of the music venue in very narrow boundaries, and I could see that there wasn't a genuine power sharing. I thought my role would be more powerful to not validate that committee, or to make sure that there's somebody outside of the committee who could ask deeper questions. And honestly, I've struggled, because sometimes in these meetings I've thought, dang, maybe I should be on there. Maybe it's my internalized oppression that had me thinking the best we can do is protest. We can't be at that table. But through watching your process and others on the committee, I feel kind of affirmed in that I do think that it's even with the good intentions, it's the boundaries set around what the committee can question, and the timeline, the unwillingness to shift the timeline, that makes that table, unfortunately, kind of like a rubber stamping body, it feels like now, where it's like you're able to talk about some of the margins, but you're agreeing to what the developers cooked behind the scenes, Could you talk about what the community could gain? Like, you're talking about this as a generational project. what's at stake? What could the benefits that the community could see if this is done well, and what are the risks if this is not done well?
So I want to do that, but I just want to touch a little bit on what you said.
Certainly,
So
yes.
I'm a deep believer in you have to be at the table, right? When decisions are being made and policy, like I'm a deep believer in you have to be at the table. And we fight so hard to get at the table because so many times we're not. But truthfully, being at the table but not having any power to change the direction is where the frustration is, and that's really important. I think we have to remember that. Yeah, we got to get to the table, but we also have to be able to change where you're going, and that's a power dynamic, right? So I think that's really important. So now
I think that's a great insight.
Yeah.
Could I?
Yeah,
we
go
might
ahead.
as well dialogue.
Yeah.
In our world, in the community organizing that I do, we've started to use a language of dual power and inside-outside strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the idea that we should be sitting at that table. And I don't want to be a force of destruction. I want what's best for my people. I want to build.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the idea that we have to have people at the table, and we have to have organized community outside of the table exchanging information, because it's about building power, right?
Exactly. So you have to have both.
Yeah.
You have to have both.
Indeed.
To make change, and no change ever happens without conflict. You do not get change without conflict. So being in the room at the table means we can have respectful dialogue, but I may disagree vehemently with what you're at, but that's my choice, but I have to respect your choice. And we may not see eye to eye, or you may not get me to see, okay, where Jake is going, yeah, I agree, but we need to be able to do that, right? And that's how you grow.
And that's goes back to what you were saying in terms of that. That takes time. It takes skilled facilitation. It takes the type of supports that people need to even go that deep with one another. And it takes, fundamentally, you can't have a legal contract signed with a developer that already dictates the outcomes and then fake a process, because people, through that type of conflict, that's when new ideas can emerge. But if there's not space for those to be implemented, then that's what I think what's dangerous about these processes. I've seen people get really burned this summer and say, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about cooperative ownership. You're telling me there's already an agreement signed? And that's how you turn people out of democracy, Mm-hmm. It's frustrating to watch.
So I think going back to what do we have to gain and what can we lose? Okay, we know that the north side has been disconnected from the river, not just from the fact of 94, but from before 94. Stretch of the river was always industrial. It was always really making money for somebody else.
How does that compare to the rest of the Minneapolis riverfront?
So we know that the rest of the city has always had much better access to the riverfront. Now, the central riverfront, was also industrial, but clearly that has changed.
You're talking about Stone Arch Bridge,
down to Minneapolis. But that was an industrial, but clearly that has changed. But we know in the history of Minneapolis, when the Grand Rounds was planned, the section for North Minneapolis was already industrial, so we weren't connected. So we've never had the kind of access that the rest of the city has. I think the bigger piece for me is the economic opportunities that go along with amenities and recreation, et cetera. So we know that as the land is developed, if it is developed primarily by people outside of our community, we know where that money is going to go. And we also know who has control, because we know that whoever owns the land has the control, period. That's just it. There's no other, in this country, within the boundaries of zoning or whatever, as a landholder, you have huge rights. So the thing is that, let's say whatever gets built out there doesn't work, right? Whoever owns the land has the ability then to change that, because the continued push is going to be to make money, to drive investment. So the pressure the pressure on whoever's developing it is to make money, to pay their investors, do whatever. The reality of the community is to be to really not have any say in, well, what happens down there? Is it good for me? Is it not good for me?
Yeah.
Does it ultimately become a place within my community, but that's not for me? If I go there, do I feel welcomed? Who do I see? What goes on? I think there's that. There's that piece, along with the rest of the riverfront is going to change. The Upper Harbor really is going to be the bellwether of how we look at what we do. When other parcels, large, whatever, start to be redeveloped, people are going to look at Upper Harbor and say, well, what did they do up there? And how did they do that? And that's a model for what a process looks like. I think all the things that are being talked about at the committee are right on. What's housing, what kind of job opportunities, access to the river, all of that. But how do you talk about that within the framework of the cultural context of the North Side, the social context of the North Side? The economic context is huge, as we know when we look at Minneapolis, and income for white people is $65,000 and income for black people is $20,000. And you can't ignore those while you're doing the work. And the fact that this is a publicly owned land that we're going to sell privately, for me, is a big issue. If it was already private, we would have much less, push on, well, what could or couldn't happen. Yeah. But the city owns all of it, so the opportunity to do this differently is there. What we see constantly is that this type of development process, which is not new, and there's sort of this trickle-down theory that we'll do these kind of jobs and this stuff will happen and it'll make the community better, has not made any significant change in the community. So reasonable people looking at the history and saying, how should we do this to make a difference, should come to the conclusion that, well, we need to work differently in order to get a different result.
Certainly. So just to game it out a little bit, it's the idea that if you sell the land to a private developer and they build housing that has a few units that might be affordable to some actually of the higher income folks over north, but that'll mean more people are coming to the neighborhood, property taxes will raise, it'll become a place to be, and somehow Northsiders, poor folks, black folks are going to benefit from that. But if you look at every single time that's been implemented, what actually happens is then property values rise, people get displaced, rent rises. The actual rents being pulled from the land are being extracted to wealthy white people who don't live in the neighborhood, and it ends up not only not producing benefits for the community, but further displacing and impoverishing folks, where if we thought about on public land, could you intentionally work with a cooperative developer or a black developer, or potentially hold the land in some sort of public trust? These are ideas that should be given more.
Yeah, I think that you have to acknowledge that capitalism as a system is not equitable.
Yeah.
And so even if it was a black developer, if they don't live in the community, or even if they live in the community, but the way they have to work, you got to go get a loan, you have to have investors. It's not designed to keep money there. And so I don't care really what color the developer is. The reality is we're using a tool that is not equitable and will not deliver the kind of things that we need.
So, could you talk about what are some of the other tools we could consider? What are some other ways to do this?
So I think, you touched on a lot of them. I think you have to think about a range of tools, and you have to have a holistic approach to this, and you have to be serious about how you're going to change the power dynamic. So when we talk about community ownership, I like to talk about it from community owns the process. They're driving it, they're dreaming, envisioning, whatever. They're benefiting in a lot of ways, not just from a service or retail or kind of a consumer-based way. And they're going to have ownership. How is that? What's that going to look like in terms of actually getting return? So I think land trusts are there. There are community ownership strategies, like I talked about the learning table, like at Market Creek Plaza, where people are investors, and there are cooperative housing and cooperative business strategies, like the Evergreen Cooperatives and other business strategies. And I think you have to have the ability to have the time to work on that and think about what's best given where we're at. I like to use this chart from the Democracy Collaborative on their community wealth building strategies. And the key things they talk about is, you have to have a whole system to get to community wealth. So, you have to talk about place, You have to talk about ownership and just some quick ones. So sort of the traditional approach to ownership is supports absentee and elite ownership, often harming locally owned firms. Collaboration. Decision-making led primarily by government and private sector, excluding local residents, versus brings many players to the table, nonprofits, philanthropy, anchors, and cities, right? So these are things like, okay, how do we get there? Jobs relies on generalized training programs without focus on linkage to actual jobs versus links training to employment and focuses on jobs for those with barriers to employment. So I always like to think you have to have an integrated plan.
Absolutely.
And you have to education, philanthropy, sustainability, everybody's got to be at the table as part of this whole process to how do we get there. And then that starts to impact what do we do on the land. We tend to like to start with what do we do on the land first because frankly it's easiest and it's what gets people jazzed up because you see pretty pictures. I'm an architect and I understand that, yeah. I can get you thrilled by showing you some like really cool building stuff.
The first time I seen the blueprints for the music venue, I had stars in my eyes, and I had to wake up for a second.
So people, that's exciting, but really that should be way later, and all this other hard work is first, and then that drives what we see emerging on the site because we're trying to solve, make an impact on these bigger economic and social challenges and these racial disparities. Like that's the problem. The problem is not we don't have buildings. The problem is, we have systemic racism. We have the huge wealth gap. We have this housing gap. That's the problem, right? So how does this project help move the needle on those things?
You just summed it up perfectly. So this is where I am. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I feel like we still have to fight in the idea that the city and the committee and the developer are trying to plow ahead at that same timeline that we've been challenging. And it seems like now that you've stepped off the committee, are you still going to be engaged in the project? Or if you want to look at it another way, how could a Northsider who's hearing this and saying, I want what you're describing, I want a community process, how would you suggest they move now?
I think that Northsiders, a community that looks at this and starts to think, okay, how can this be better? I think one of the things is that, we have to recognize that people are out here every day trying to get through life.
Certainly.
And, they're working 2 jobs, taking care of their kids, doing whatever, and they don't have time to read the Democracy Collaborative. I think one of the things that we have to work on, as we're out here organizing, working, is helping people to understand sort of the bedrock things, because people see like, oh, we need more of housing. That's a good thing. We need this. Okay, that's a good thing. Helping them understand you can benefit from you get this versus someone else is benefiting from the continued wealth piece of it. I think we have to work on that in our community. How do we help people understand it? Then at the same time, this is a political process.
Yeah.
Every time you would ask it, people would ask, in a meeting, well, how can we change this? And someone from the city would say, well, you are free to talk to your elected official, right? So I would encourage people, one, to get involved and to understand what's going on in the project and to get a handle on what are they really trying to do, and two, to contact your elected official or officials and ask them if you have concerns why it's going one way or another. I'm an optimist, so I still believe that there's an opportunity to deliver more to the north side.
I honestly do too.
And so I didn't get off the committee to say I'm done, I'm quitting, I'm going to go home and I'm not going to go to meetings anymore, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that that community has to be more involved to deliver. I think we have to be, if we look at our history, we can look at lots of projects that have happened on the north side where people have said, oh, this is going to make a big difference, whether it be Heritage Park, the school district headquarters on West Broadway, and we continue to look at these kind of project-based things saying, oh, yeah, they're going to move these other things socially and economically, and realistically they don't.
Yeah.
All right, so I think we have to get out of that mentality, and that's across the board. That's leadership, to get out of this, hey, isn't great. We're getting more stuff. There's a guy in town just the other day named Brian Lee. He runs a design justice practice.
God, I missed it. Folks keep recommending
Yeah, oh
it to
man,
me.
it was the bomb, Jake. And he talks about we have to stop looking at the stuff. We have to get over the stuff and really get down into what's really going on. And he talks about how architecture and development are part of a system of using power to build racialized spaces. And it's really powerful. Really powerful. And I think that, what is great about when I've seen Brian twice now, and it's like, okay, it's affirming that, okay, there's somebody else talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not crazy, and he's out here trying to do this. So I think that we need to continue to do this work. If we were in another part of the city where people have more time and maybe more knowledge and maybe more representation, they would push back. And also, I just have to be honest, when we push back, it's like, well, what's wrong with you guys? When other people push back, it's like, oh, we have to think about this. Right? What's the difference?
Some people are celebrated for participating in democracy, and others just, don't you know what's good for you?
Right. And, so it is a democracy. We need to continue. If we don't believe that this is what's best for the community, then we should continue to advocate for what's best.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to say thanks for sitting down with us, and I really respect your decision to join the committee and fight for the community, and I respect your decision to step off because it seems like the best way to fight for the community now, and I really appreciate you sharing your passion. Like, I love the ideas and the values that you're laying out. I didn't know that I was into architecture and design until I got into it. I came from, more of the perspective of racial and economic justice or class politics, and I realized that this is the way we build something different. It's a beautiful potential and a beautiful vision. So thanks for sitting down with us. Thanks for your work. And thanks for tuning in. We'll post links to some of the materials that Paul was sharing. We'll post a link to the powerful letter that he wrote along with the co-chair of the committee who also resigned. And really encourage folks, if you're listening to this, keep tuned in. We're gonna start inviting folks out to meetings and start sharing this information. These are big questions that we all should have a part in asking and answering. We'll be back. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands building up the company. Shauna told me I was gonna be prosperous. I listen. I'm just praying, make a place a positive addition. Try to knock me off my spot would be preposterous. Y'all fishing in this bitch, illuminate like phosphorus. I glisten, gliding like a Christ on the water. Now you're christened, sliding like I'm ice over top the opposition. Hold a vision in my mind and make it pop about fruition. Expanding these demands, we will not crop the propositions. Shelf the cold food, guaranteed the whole mood. The rest, you're gonna inherit the earth that holds true. Culture power grows, gonna deal them a few blows. The elders transcended the